So I'm going to kick us off for day 2. Good to see you all again. Hope you enjoyed the first day. So I'm going to start us off with ethical research. And my particular take on this, or at least what I thought would be fun and useful for this training session, is specifically to talk about aligning transparency and reproducibility with protections for human subjects. So while ethics can be more than just that, I hope that this is a useful blend of conceptualization, which if you can't tell, I'm a big fan of conceptualizing things right from the get-go, or at least trying to before you start marching, as well as the pragmatics that you might have to encounter when practicing open science. This presentation is going to be based off of an ongoing project. We're in the analysis and write-up stage that's investigating the intersection of open science with institutional review boards, specifically R1 and R2 university IRBs in the US, and based on the common rule. So that'll probably be where most of my understanding, examples, and whatnot come from. So apologies to those who don't work in that context, but hopefully there are generalizable principles, and happy to chat about them in the discussion that translate to whatever kind of regulatory context you sit within for human subjects, because hopefully we all sit within one, and it's important to figure out what exactly is that context for the research that you're doing. And our hope with this project is to see whether policies that promote open science are compatible with the protections for human research subjects that dominate kind of the U.S. human subjects university health research. I just want to give a shout out to my co-collaborator on this, Casey Bauskill at RAND, who's totally awesome, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for funding this project. So I'm not going to be really talking about the results, but insights that we have so far that I think will be useful for this workshop. So just so you know what the presentation, my goals for it all, and exactly what this project is, so you know where I'm coming from with my thoughts on this, I want to examine how to consider open science practices during IRB review, Research Ethics Committee review, whatever it might be called in your context, and specifically how protections for human research subjects align with what I would call our RT2 transparent and reproducible workflow. And in terms of the things that we've done in our project that are informing my thoughts on this, we've done a document analysis of the federal regulations, policy, and guidance on the protection of human subjects, particularly the common rule regulations, knowing that there are others at the federal level, and then you're subject, at least in the U.S., to state, local, and institutional regulations. But to sort of simplify at that ground level, primarily focusing on the common rule, which I'll go into in a second. And then we did surveys of IRB chairs, members, administrators, and then follow-up in-depth interviews to examine their thoughts about our take on the alignment of open science practices with these regulations. So just my reflexivity, this is where I'm coming from, so that you understand where my thoughts are from, challenge them, questions, etc. But this is the kind of discussion that I am going to lead us through until 10 o'clock. We're going to try and stay on schedule. So have you seen this slide yet? Okay, cool. So while I think in the past, some of the presentations that have done this conceptual introductory ethical research might have picked one or two of these practices on our roadmap, I'm going to say consider the whole thing from the get-go. Data de-identification and sharing definitely is the thing that is most relevant to regulations, and that's why following this, you have that practical how-to for de-identifying your data. But I think that from both the protection of risk side, as well as you'll see in a second, some aspects of the principle of beneficence, everything in this space is at least in a gray zone of relevance for institutional review boards and human research protections, if not in some ways, I think, more directly aligned than current practice and policy is suggesting. And as an aside, one of the cool things from the project, even before writing it up, we've had some of the IRB chairs email us after just taking the survey to say, we are reconsidering some of our policies and practice and guidance just based on the questions you posed, because we rooted it not in just this general, what do you think and what are your attitudes, but really in the regulations that they face. So when I get to the final slides that are less about your own workflows and more about being a catalyst, I'm going to really encourage you to think about IRBs and other human research protection professionals as stakeholders that you can intervene with and try and see the world from their point of view so that you can align those incentives, and that's one more part of your research ecosystem that might be reinforcing transparency and reproducibility. But that said, all of the slides from previous session, Alex, Katie, from like previous years, those are still in the OSF, right? So check those out. Jen Sturdy, who's a former BITS person, had an awesome presentation last year, as well as Scott Desposato, is that who did it? Desposato, and they have different takes on this general issue, so I welcome you to read theirs as well to get a fuller breadth and understanding of what ethical research means in the context of transparent and reproducible workflows. So in terms of how we've approached this as a project, as I start with kind of all of my projects that are about facilitating the movement of open science from the perspective of a shift in the scientific ecosystem that influences all stakeholders. So you're probably here because at some point you've noticed from a funder, a journal, a colleague, some other stakeholder, maybe a peer in your program, that the research community is moving towards open science as a default approach for research, and in particular, research involving human subjects, which I imagine is the case for pretty much everyone in this room if you're being recruited from a social science community, right? We're interested in people, so it's going to be relevant. The key stakeholders who are always targeted in the initiatives are the journals, the funders, and increasingly now academic societies that are expecting, if not requiring, the use of some of the open practices that we talk about in this workshop by investigators who they are funding, who are trying to publish in their journals, who are part of their societies. And a lot of the time, particularly in the social science space, this is research that involves human subjects or data from human subjects. So I like expanding this and thinking about a whole systems approach and thinking about who are the other stakeholders who are missing. Those are the gaps that I'm really interested in when I talked about gaps yesterday. Who are the people who are not at this table, stakeholder groups, who do work in this area, and as the default approach of one's professional area changes, is going to influence them. And since they are people, they are active agents, they are going to react to changes in their social structure and then might influence our behaviors. So I'd rather get the jump, get them aligned with this movement instead of 2 or 3 years down the line facing a roadblock we could have anticipated. For more information or a cool write-up on reasons in favor of transparency and reproducibility from an ethical perspective, check out Fernando's blog post on this on the BITS blog. He's increasingly becoming the guy to go talk to Fernando. So apologies if we've increased your list this week, but you know, you're a postdoc at BITS. That's what you signed up for. And so from our point of view, we think that, at least in the US, institutional review boards are an often overlooked yet critical stakeholder to consider in these efforts. I think when we've seen them considered, it's typically from the point of view of an investigator, and the narrative is these folks could be a roadblock. So here are some tips to get over that roadblock. And building off our conversation yesterday, these are research support specialists. Forget who here said right there. All right. So that's why I was asking, like, which kind of specialist do you identify with? And you'll find if you talk to these human beings, think of them like your neighbor next door. They're lovely people who are doing their jobs and really appreciate when you proactively engage them and make things work. So from my point of view, IRBs are important to more directly engage in this movement towards open science because as a key stakeholder in the scientific enterprise, they can both influence and are influenced by expectations that investigators, yourselves, will practice open science in your human subjects research going forward. So an example of each, IRBs, at least again in the UX common rule context, can require modifications to and theoretically even disapprove data sharing plans based on the information that you provide in your applications, your protocol, and informed consent forms. So, they'll only disapprove it if you're really being obstinate. Don't be an asshole. Most people will work with you to make it something that's approved. But theoretically, they have the regulatory power to do that if you don't meet things that are compliant with the regulations. Conversely, and I think this was one of the hooks that we got IRB professionals who originally thought, open science, that sounds like some nerdy thing that doesn't apply to me. So then realize like, oh shit, I need to start thinking about this, that their workflows have the potential to significantly increase if more and more of their submissions require higher levels of IRB review. So things that would have been exempt if someone didn't say, I want to share my data, are now not exempt. And then if those are folks who have no experience or capacity in sharing their data, the IRB has no policies, procedures, guidelines, templates, improved language in place. They're going to see more people proposing things that they're going to have to work with them, go back and forth. And again, as a human being who is overworked, your IRB professional at your institution is incentivized to figure out ways where everybody's happy and the workload stays down. And so making them realize, it might not be too long in the future where everybody has to do this, and the number of studies that are not exempt and need full review might go from 5 or 10% to 60% or more. Like, do you have the resources, human, financial, time to take that on board? So again, when you're thinking about whatever stakeholders that might be a gap in your area, I've found success personally in being empathetic and thinking from their point of view and finding those wins, and that was a big one for us in this space. So moving on from that approach to this wider area, I want to first start with ethical principles for research involving human subjects, and particularly those that are codified in rather influential documents, particularly in health research. And I'm going to, after this slide, or the next two slides, ask for some participation from the audience, since I know it's the beginning of another long day, so I want to get you going to get engaged. But to lay the foundation, is anyone familiar with the Declaration of Helsinki from the World Medical Association? Does it ring a bell to anybody? See some nods? Cool. Again, I love all of you, but that makes me happy. And so amongst all of their standards or ethical principles for research involving human subjects, they actually have a section on some of the open science practices that we're discussing this week. Namely, they have one principle that says, every research study involving human subjects must be registered in a publicly accessible database before recruitment of the first subject. So there's our pre-registration stuff that we were talking about yesterday. And then as we move on to sharing the products and findings of our research, they say researchers, authors, sponsors, which typically means funders in this context, or institutions, either or, editors and publishers, so they've got a whole list of stakeholders there beyond just the researcher, all have ethical obligations with regard to the publication and dissemination of the results of research. Researchers have a duty to make publicly available the results of their research on human subjects and are accountable for the completeness and accuracy of their reports. So that speaks to reporting guidelines for your research, things like Consort and Prisma. All parties should adhere to accepted guidelines for ethical reporting. Negative and inconclusive, as well as positive results, must be published or otherwise made publicly available. So there's your file drawer. Sources of funding, institutional affiliation, and conflicts of interest must be declared in the publication. There's the conflicts of interest stuff that Ted was talking about. And reports of research not in accordance with the principles of this declaration should not be accepted for publication. I'm not saying you're going to have success with this approach, since institutions and organizations tend to sign up nominally for things that don't have any teeth behind them. But if you see anyone who has signed up to this declaration and they're not doing these things, you're not out of line to bring this up with them and initiate a conversation. So again, want to set the expectation that, being part of this movement is a long and hard road. I think it's worth it. But here's one piece of ammunition you can use to engage some of your stakeholders, colleagues, etc., to say, if you signed up for this thing, you've signed up for registration, results reporting, reporting guidelines, etc. Now, in the U.S. context, moving towards the principles that actually have some teeth behind them, that have some enforcement capacities by a compliance office, we move to the Belmont Report. So any U.S. investigators here familiar with the training that you have to do every once in a while? You guys love it, right? Super engaging and entertaining. So these are the ethical principles that provide the foundation for the regulations in the U.S. And beyond what's written in the regulation, they're also what are theoretically used by members of your institutional review board as their analytic framework. So particularly when they're trying to make judgments about a particular study in front of them, to resolve any ethical issues that are brought up in a new study, they think about 3 key principles: respect for the persons who are the human subjects in the study, the beneficence of the study, essentially the risk-benefit ratio, with a particular emphasis on risks, right? It's protection of human subjects is always the tagline. So the main thing they care about are risks. And then justice, social justice, equity. So these are the 3 things that are in their mind. This is the part where I would love some participation. I'm going to go into a few of the pieces of language in the Belmont Report on these principles and pose a question as to whether you think that language has some sort of implication for an open science practice. These are one of the things that we asked in our survey. So while we're still analyzing the results, I don't want to jump the gun. Nothing got 100%. We strongly agree with all of this, right? There's different interpretations. So I think there's no wrong answers here, per se, I guess is what I'm saying. Feel comfortable sharing for and against, knowing that you might feel social pressure to say, yeah, all of these things mean we should do open science, in this room at least. So in terms of respect for persons, one of the things that's discussed is the comprehension of the information about risks, particularly in the informed consent process. So I quote that investigators have an obligation to ascertain that the information about risks to subjects is complete and adequately comprehended during informed consent. So my question for you, if investigators tell subjects that de-identified data will be shared, the thing that you're going to learn to do in a second, do they have an obligation to ascertain, to really make sure that subjects adequately comprehend risks of breaches in confidentiality due to technological advances in data matching and re-identification? Is all you have to say that we're going to de-identify your data? Or do you need to take a step further and say, so here's what we're going to do, but just so as you know, technology is advancing rapidly, and there's still a chance, might be small, but a non-zero probability chance that someone can use some technology or find some other data set to re-identify you. Any yays? Do they have this obligation? So, like, anyone want to substantiate the nods or murmurs?
I think there's a real danger there. There's a real danger there in that you are essentially talking about requiring somebody to give an expert opinion on something which is very much not accessible to most researchers. And so I would say the right answer is that an expert should, and maybe the IRB even could be part of this, where that expert is supported or sits.
Okay. So you think there is there is an obligation, but maybe it's not. The investigator needs to make sure that somebody or something explains this.
Yeah. And so I guess the responsibility could still remain with the PI, but it feels like that's, from an institutional thinking point of view, like bonkers.
Right. The pragmatics, right? And that's key for this stuff. I'll get to broad consent later, but the pragmatics are the thing that's really gotten in the way of institutions taking up broad consent, for those who are familiar with it.
I think what's also a challenge there is the individual consenting and...
Alex. Oh, you got one? I was going to say, you can...
Sorry, is it... You can't... So I think one of the challenges here as well is the individuals that are on the collecting side, right? So what I'm imagining here is that the individual who's doing the consent is typically a research assistant with potentially limited understanding of what's really happening in the broad context of the study. So it's happening at one site, there's a PI at that site. The data is then collected and then transmitted to the individual doing the analyses. So you have so many moving parts here that this can get lost, and the meaning of these words can get lost between that transfer from collection and the individual who's really talking to the person from whence this data comes, to the person doing the analysis, the pre-registration plan, and the dissemination, whatever dissemination means. And so I think the words get sort of muddled, and really making the burden here is then put back on the participant in a really complicated way that I think is counter to the ethics of what we want to do and what we aspire to. So I think this gets really tricky really fast and operationally problematic.
One more on this one?
So I completely agree. Is the mic on?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I completely agree that it's not fair to put the burden on the participant, because if you're working in a context like in development economics and you're doing household surveys in rural areas where people's grasp of sort of like my grasp of what technological advances in data matching and re-identification could possibly do is tenuous. If you have people who are not nearly as integrated with technology as me, like it's really not fair to expect them to take on the responsibility of understanding that. Yeah.
Okay, one more. Go on then.
I mean, I agree with what's been said, but then is the solution not to tell them that that is even a possibility? I think that any step that could be taken in making subjects more aware of what could happen with their data, not just because of crazy hackers, but also because of your own failures as PIs to de-identify properly, to not accidentally push it up on your public GitHub as opposed to your private GitHub repository. I mean, I think these things happen more than we are happy to acknowledge. And so I think even though, of course, there will be issues in making sure that every single subject really understands the breadth of the possibilities of what could happen with the data that they're providing, any step that we could take in making that understanding more clear is a step in a good direction.
Cool. Okay, and then I'm like, so I love this, but I've got a few more, and I know I'm trying to save the time. So without discouraging further chatting, last one for this one, we've got 3 or 4 more slides like
I
this.
totally agree with you. I think that pushing the responsibility up the chain a little bit, so the PI really has to take responsibility and the institution has to support them in understanding the actual risks, and then you make it clear to the subject that we are responsible for the risks and we are being held accountable by these systems, something like that.
So awesome. Again, got a few more slides that I think will be in the same vein. 2 contextual points I'll throw out there without landing on either side of this. One, we asked about all of these ethical principles in the survey because there are a lot of commentary and opinion pieces out there by open science proponents who do talk about IRBs, and they do it from the principles. And an IRB person's going to say, cool, but pragmatically, how do we do that, right? Like, how do we feasibly implement this? So that's a concern. For this particular principle, as I'll get to in a second, the common rule was revised and went into effect earlier this year, and it's the first time it's happened since it was written in the 70s. And one of the main concerns that kicked off that process, which was like 10 years, like they first announced this in 2007 or 8 or something, a notice of proposed rule change making, was increasing capabilities to re-identify data. And one of the things that made it into the regulations was that the Office for Human Research Protections, the executive branch enforcement of the law, of the code, needs to come up with a list of technologies that can lead to data matching and re-identification. And if someone is proposing to use those technologies, that could escalate the risk level and therefore the level of review. That list is to be released, so we don't know what those are yet. But this is very much not just of interest to researchers, but this is one of the things that like IRBs are anxiously awaiting to help them think about, okay, cool, feasibly, how do we do this? Next one, beneficence, and particularly the concept of anticipated benefit to society. So beneficence requires, I quote from the Belmont Report, we be concerned about the loss of the substantial benefits that might be gained from research. As a result, the report recommends that, quote, the anticipated benefit to society in the form of knowledge to be gained from the research should be part of the assessment of risks and benefits, and that's the assessment that ultimately leads to IRB approval of the submitted study procedures. So my question, love some new voices. Are benefits to society, particularly in the form of generalizable knowledge to be gained from research, lost when investigators do not make the products and findings of their research publicly available?
Well, I actually thought something almost the opposite, which is, if you're doing a study on an extremely sensitive topic where there would be very high risk to participants if their data are disclosed, the loss is greater if you don't do the research if the idea was you shouldn't do it if you can't publicly post the data.
Interesting. How about the results? Distinguishing the data from the results.
I think there are, well, I mean, this gets into those like tricky technologies, right? But yeah, and I guess, I mean, this is an area where I don't feel educated enough. For example, when I work with restricted data, there are, you know, the organization has to review it before I publish anything to look for deductive disclosure risk. I have to round ends, things like that, but I don't really know if that's good enough. So yeah, more education on that for me would probably be good.
Okay, cool. There's a session after this on de-identification and restricted access. You should go to it.
I'll think about that.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say yes, especially given a lot of studies in the US are publicly funded, and so if the beneficial to the taxpayer, which is like if my money is going to a study, if it's a clinical trial, RCT somewhere, and the PI decided to sit on that data and not publish the results because it's null or it just doesn't look good, then how did you get the IRB? Then what's the point? Like, right? So you have to pursue a research and then publish results with knowing that it may not be good or may be bad, but because I'm getting funding from taxpayers, if it's publicly funded. If it's private, then that's a whole different scenario. But if it's publicly funded, yes, you should publish the results and make that data public. Obviously, be identified, but make that information public so people know that information is out there and what the study, where my money went. Obviously, not all taxpayers know where the money goes, but at least that information is out there.
You're going to love the slide after the next slide. All right. Also in Beneficence, estimating the probability of harm or benefits. Review committees should determine whether, I quote, estimates of the probability of harm or benefits are reasonable, as judged by known facts or other available studies. My question for some new voices in the room: when investigators do not make the results of a research study publicly available, do they impair the ability of IRBs to accurately estimate the probability of harm or benefit of future studies in that research area? You're also able to ask, what the hell am I trying to say, if that's one of the things going through your head.
I mean, I've always been confused with the justification of research benefits for IRBs because we always write something equivalent to we could discover something that changes the way policy is done globally, right? We essentially write a version of that phrase every time we write a justification for doing research. So that's kind of baked in. We rarely do, but we always say we could because we could. How to weigh the possibility that we discover some globe changing new insight versus what harms, I think is kind of silly in concept. So I don't know what harms are materially weighed against that if people aren't getting materially hurt. And so I think something we focus on a lot obviously is physical risk avoidance and so on and so forth, but again, it's hard to weigh against disclosure, right? So
any thoughts about if a study found a negative or null result and wasn't published, and then the future IRB not knowing that that's what happened, knowing that they focus on risk? That's kind of the voice that's posing this question when it's posed.
I think if something went bad and you didn't make it public, you can redo it and it would do more harm. And my other question is, benefit for who? For the people involved in the study or for the greater public?
It's a great question. And they're supposed to consider both, primarily the individual, but the generalizable knowledge to be gained is also part of the equation. And so then thinking from the point of view of that human being or group of human beings who meet together and are making some kind of calculation in their head of how things balanced. I mean, another question to pose for those of you who are on IRBs, or I inspire to engage with your IRBs, is do you actually do a literature search and look for previous studies or do a systematic review? Do you just rely on what the investigators tell you, and are they incentivized to tell you the things to get this through review? Because from their point of view, you're a bureaucratic hurdle, right? What are the processes that actually underlie this thing that from a US context, they are actually asked to do? Like this principle gets baked into the guideline, the regulations themselves. And then for my friend in the back, last one, justice, publicly funded research. The Belmont Report states, whenever research supported by public funds leads to the development of therapeutic devices and procedures, justice demands that these not provide advantages only to those who can afford them. Question, does the principle of justice therefore require that the products of publicly funded research, including study protocols, data, code, materials, results, be made publicly available and as open a matter as possible, as it is the public who has paid for this and therefore has a right to those products? Any no's? Anybody disagree with this? Or at least would temper this more than you think is your perceived norm of this room?
I'm not a no. I'm not a no. I'm a yes. So,
okay.
Yeah, don't rush me out of here yet. But
sorry.
I mean, the argument I often hear, at least from epidemiology and medical public health research, is about, and I guess it depends on what you mean as open a manner as possible. It's about people who've invested, let's say, a lot of time and the public's money in, let's say, recruiting, collecting a big cohort of people and following them over some time period or whatever. And the idea that if they just immediately give that data to everyone else, what's their incentive to do it? I don't personally buy that argument, but I think that's the argument that you hear often from people who are like, what's my incentive to spend all this time, recruiting and collecting, establishing a new cohort of people if I'm just going to turn that over to everybody? And I think that's part of the pushback I've heard, from investigators in public health.
And so I think what a great distinction there that I think is kind of really speaks to where the movement's at now, where folks who have been doing this are really interested in examples of implementation beyond just like the general principles. In as open a manner as possible isn't just about the how and the where, but the when, right? Like timing is part of that. And as open as manner as possible, as immediately as possible, but no earlier than. And maybe there are regulations or policies in place, like a funder saying, you've got a year. Once you've collected your final outcome, you got a year. And that's the importance of thinking ahead, both in terms of like getting things going while you're collecting data, and then budgeting the time and the people to get those things done in a year, assuming that they actually start reinforcing those policies, which they haven't really, but maybe one day. All right, last one for the seminar portion of this session.
I wonder what people think about two things. One is, in addition to as open a manner as possible, should it be as accessible in terms of understandability to the general public, which might not just mean that your paper and data are up on the internet somewhere. And two, so this is linking the monetary funding to our right to consuming the research. But how about the contribution of your subjects? So do you have an obligation to your subjects to make the funding of the research that they contributed to? So for example, a study might be funded by American taxpayers, but it might be on subjects in a third country or another country. Do I have an obligation to go back to the town that was my RCT location and hold an open meeting and distribute the results in a way that's not just open but consumable by the subjects of my research?
Awesome. So two things I'll say before I go on. First, a question. Who here has done a study involving human subjects where you did not return the results back to those subjects? You did it, you published, maybe they read it, but you didn't send them back emails or go do one of these sessions. All right, that's awesome that there are folks in the room who are saying they've done it for every study by keeping your hands down. Congratulations, that's awesome. But that return to subjects has been a key part of the changes to the Common Rule as well. So while I haven't really included it here, it's related to open science, but it's more about specifically back to the folks who participate in the research and the communities who participate in the research. That's a key thing, as well as commercialization. So the Henrietta Lacks story, and that if you are intending to commercialize the findings, that's something that needs to be in your informed consent form now. The other thing, when you're talking about not just making things open, but then accessible, interoperable, usable, understandable, kind of the fair data principles. I'm part of this Academy Health group now, which is a health services research group that, funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, is trying to just like transform health services research. And I'm one of the 3 teams that's basically in this open science space. And we are particularly have been tasked with, as I understand it, more of the making things open and not just being a data dump, which can be as opaque as not sharing anything if you don't do all of the awesome stuff that the instructors in the next hour or 2 are going to tell you about. But then how much of it is communication and language? And another group's been tasked with that. And we just keep finding ourselves veering into their territory. It's like, well, if we do all of this, but you can't understand any of it, it sort of is an own goal. So, but it's an open and great question. So I ask these because there's no hard and fast answers to these in particular, at least from the point of view of an IRB. Like I said, the Likert scale responses in all of these were across the board for all of them. But then as we move from these principles, one of the things that I think is the pragmatic advice in last half of this presentation going into your data de-identification workshops is institutional review boards as compliance offices. And so, well, I think it's accurate, totally accurate, to regard IRBs and the members on them as ethics bodies with moral obligations with human beings who care about other human beings. I think that they should be understood fundamentally through a regulatory lens. The reason why they exist, their principal function is a compliance office that's responsible for ensuring that an institution's human subjects research is compliant with regulations. IRBs have an obligation from their employers, the university, the institution that they are part of, to be responsive to these regulatory protections first and foremost. That is their primary job. And so much like scientists, who we ascribe to all these openness things, when we have competing demands, right, the status quo has been, let's write the sexy narrative and get it in. If you're an IRB person who has a lot of competing demands, maybe you're not a researcher, so you haven't gotten the training on all of these other principles about sharing and whatnot, and you're working at a moment right now where, as the open science movement is gaining traction, there are historic regulatory changes, these changes to the Common Rule that I've talked about, that have not only privacy and confidentiality as a core goal, but a big part of what motivated this was complaints from investigators about IRB overreach, about going beyond their job, going beyond their role. And believe it or not, IRBs listen when they hear that and they say, okay, fine, we'll take a step back if you think that we're going too far. And so when push comes to shove, they, and I know this is going to sound like a lot of double negatives, but I found this is really how it's thought through. They're about avoiding compliance. Right? So they want to make sure that your study is not non-compliant. That is how their mind will work. So they're primarily going to look at the things that are landmines, right? What are the things that if you do this, if you share data this way, and that's why we focus on this here, we're not going to approve this, or the risk level goes up, something like that. Then beyond that, you got to look for the motivated folks, or the folks who have the time, like the early adopters in this room from the researcher community, who then might go above and beyond the minimum requirements for their position. And I think this kind of framing I found really helpful from a pragmatic point of view in trying to get changes in policies and practices. Definitely combined with the ethical and principle arguments, but if you don't take the pragmatic arguments in mind as well, I don't think you're going to see much change in success. So I've been mentioning the Common Rule a bit. For those who aren't familiar, it's the U.S. federal policy for the protection of human subjects. This policy, that's the Code of Federal Regulations number in case anyone is masochistic enough to look it up and read through it, like I did a bunch of times for this project. I've got the link there. This applies to all research involving human subjects that's conducted, supported, or otherwise subject to regulation by any federal department or agency that takes appropriate administrative action to make the policy applicable to such research. What the hell does that mean? If an agency signs up for this, then it means that they have to enforce it. And it basically, there's an ecosystem where Let's take the NIH as part of Health and Human Services. If you get an NIH grant, the institution needs to say, we have registered with our Office of Human Research Protections as an organization that is adhering to these regulations, and we have an office in our organization, the IRB, who's going to review every study to make sure that nothing is not compliant. And there's 20 agencies, including HHS, but probably any agency that's relevant to anybody who's looking for federal funding in this room is most likely a signatory to this. So it's going to be relevant if you're working in a U.S. context, at the very least with the U.S. funder. And as Jen Sturdy said in her BITS blog, which I have the link there, go check it out, there's a bit of a tension between open science and human research protections and the common rule. So the regulations that are most relevant to open science, as I've said, are concerned with minimizing the risk of harm that results from breaches in the privacy of subjects and the confidentiality of their data. These regulations are also the top priority for IRBs, again, given these significant deliberations and the rule changes about privacy, de-identification, and so forth. So there's this tension between that reinvigorated importance of IRBs to prevent the risk of harm resulting from these breaches, and then from the rest of the scientific ecosystem where you are seeing more and more of these expectations, if not requirements, to apply open science practices, and in particular, from the IRB context, sharing your data, and something that I think that they're not quite appreciating yet, sharing your code. Like what someone was talking about accidentally putting something on a public GitHub instead of private. What if you have your code that you use to de-identify in there, and then there's some way to reverse engineer it and say, oh, okay, so if I run this backwards, now I've got you, right? So I think code is something that's not in the language, but as OHRP, who sort of interprets and enforces this language, something that I think that they should take on board, if not maybe even the materials themselves, if there's something about, here are the questions we ask that can link up to other data sets. And so I want to walk through now in these final slides how to mitigate these tensions through policies, guidance, and training. I'll have a few slides on things from your point of view as a researcher who might be submitting a protocol to an IRB, and I hope that these principles apply to those who aren't in the US context. And then a few final slides of, if you're really jazzed about this stakeholder group and working with them, some suggestions of things that you might want to try at your institution with your institutional review board to create institutional change. So as Jen says, we need to have a tailored rather than a one-size-fits-all data and code sharing strategy for each project. So think about it not as a dichotomy of share or not share, but on a spectrum from direct to restricted access with some sort of limitations in that middle ground, depending on the requirements for your study, your reasons for data sharing. Is it computational reproducibility? Is it some other reason? And the promises of confidentiality that you've made to your participants or that you've been requested to make from your IRB, and making sure that that access is clearly defined, if nowhere else, in that informed consent process, because if you don't have that there, that's the kind of thing in particular that an IRB will say, by not having it in the informed consent form, practicing that open science practice is non-compliant. We want to not be non-compliant, so we're not going to let you do that, or you need to go back and reconsent everybody. So what can you do? First of all, describe your open science practices when submitting your study to the IRB. So one of the parts of these regulations are for IRBs to do an initial review of research. This is typically in some kind of standardized online system, application documents, and/or forms or templates to describe your study protocol. Include all of your practices in this so that if they approve it, data sharing, code sharing, whatever, who knows if the interpretation of these laws change over time, it's in there, it's approved, you're good to go. This helps to ensure that you have the approval to do the things that you want to do, and you don't have to face that oh shit moment down the line where you're hoping they're not going to say you need to reconsent, or we're just not going to give you approval to do this because you didn't ask for it at the beginning. In particular, as you'll get into in the next session, consider risks from data sharing and therefore the subsequent level of IRB review. Even if you are a non-exempt study, I'm sure all of you would love a one-and-done process, right? You write this up, the IRB says, cool beans, and you don't have to do months of back and forth. I had a friend who had an IRB process in grad school that took up to a year because his study was focus groups with those who access child pornography online. So an incredibly complex ethical topic. And I think he had 3 or 4 rounds of iterations with his research ethics committee. So make sure in particular when you're talking about these issues that are most directly related to privacy and confidentiality, because these words are in the regulations, consider these risks from data sharing. So some of the key issues from the US context, if you're not in the US context, look up the regulations or chat with your IRB personnel about them, include the degree to which you have information that's private or biospecimen and the degree to which they're identifiable, whether you're using any kind of analytic techniques that can generate identifiable information, exemption categories that have criteria about the identifiability of subjects. So if you're shooting for an exempt study, then you need to make sure that you're in line with those regulations. And then whatever you've said you're going to do, that there are adequate procedures for protecting privacy and maintaining confidentiality.